Welcome everybody to this session of ER 2023 on energy transitions, both historical and future. My name's Charlie Wilson, and I'm here with my colleague. Well, I shall hand over to Radhika to introduce herself.
Thanks, Charlie. I'm Radhika Khosla. Charlie and I are colleagues from the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford.
And so we've curated this session with 4 really interesting talks covering different dimensions of the energy transition question. And we're just going to begin by giving a short kind of framing from a global perspective. So let me just share my screen. There we go. Excellent. Okay, so yeah, we'll come back to this. This is the overview of the session. And so this brief framing talk from myself and Radhika is just to sort of set the scene in a very big picture level with respect to the global energy transition. And as this kind of long run graph, both historical and into the future shows, the global energy system has accumulated, particularly since the Industrial Revolution worldwide, and is now probably the largest infrastructure system worldwide, deeply capital intensive, and as the graph shows, overwhelmingly fossil fuel based. And obviously to limit climate change, we need to shift rapidly and systemically away from fossil fuels dominating the energy supply. And there are different pathways by which we can do this. And this particular one from Rystad Energy shows a very strong renewable transition, as you can see from the right-hand side. But the global energy transition is not just about energy resources. So this is a global Sankey diagram showing the flow of energy that's being captured in the energy resources or the primary energy on the left, transformed into energy carriers in the middle. And there are 2 major transformations that happen in the global energy system. The top one shows crude oil being transformed into liquid and gaseous fuels. And then the middle one shows pretty much all energy resources being converted into electricity. And then those 2 energy carriers, as well as some direct energy resources, are used in the energy using sectors on the right-hand side: industry, buildings, and transportation. Now watch this, look at this slide. This is the current snapshot. You can see the fossil dominated system, but watch as I toggle to the next slide, which shows the picture in 2060. This is in a renewable scenario in which net zero emissions are reached in 2060. And you can see some enormous differences from where we are today. Fossil fuels are almost entirely eliminated, very rapid transition to solar, wind, and biomass, a massive expansion of electricity generation as an energy carrier, and as a result, pervasive electrification of how energy is used in the 3 end use sectors. Electrified end use tends also to be much more efficient. And so actually, if you look on the top right, final consumption globally is around 390 exajoules, and that's about a 15% decrease from where we are today, despite rising population and GDP. However, this use of energy is not the final story. It's not the final energy which ultimately we care about. It's what that final energy is used for in terms of delivering us useful energy or energy services, things like mobility, heating, lighting, and so forth. And the energy services story is extremely important because ultimately it's the energy services which provide us with human needs and then well-being and welfare as a result. So Roger Fouquet in the UK has reconstructed the share of energy going to different energy services all the way back to 1700s in the UK. And similar to the energy resources story, you can see this huge expansion through the course of the 20th century. But also beneath this expansion, there is quite rapid often shifts in the efficiency and the cost of different energy services as a result of technological and social innovation. So the future energy transition, projecting forward to 2100, also has important characteristics in terms of energy services. Most importantly, expansion of energy services in the global south to provide for decent living standards for all, but using much less energy resource input. It's also becoming extremely likely in a warming world that our needs for certain energy services will change, for example, with respect to cooling as well as heating in places like the global north, where this has less been common historically. So last year, the IPCC synthesized all the evidence around net zero energy systems in the energy transition. And these 6 bullet points you see in the top box are the ones that I've just run through in terms of the global energy picture. Fossil fuels out of the system, massive expansion of zero or negative CO2 electricity generation, and then widespread electrification of energy end use. We're also likely to see much more integration across different energy conversion chains, particularly between electricity, heat, and then novel fuels like hydrogen, ammonia, and so forth. But it's really important to make sure in this energy transition story that we don't lose sight of the energy services which the energy system ultimately are delivering. And here the transition requires us to improve the quality and accessibility of energy services, particularly in the global south. And this is also where this very strong emphasis on justice and equity comes into the transition story. So we've learned a lot from historical work on what the future energy transition may look like, but there's still much that we do not know. And Radhika and I and other colleagues are guest editing a special issue of Environmental Research Letters on exactly this topic. And we've picked 7 subtopics, if you like, which we think are still critical for shaping the future energy transition and where there's key knowledge insights to which we collectively as scientists contribute. And you can see these 7 topic areas here. The issue launched earlier in the year. We've had papers submitted from the spring and summer onwards, and it's exciting to see it take shape. We've got 7 now papers which are already published that you can see here, and on a wide variety of topics, from the energy supply to the energy carriers, electrification, to energy end use. You can see papers there on shared mobility, on lifestyles, and on transportation. And one of them I've highlighted, the paper by Vadim Vinichenko, because one of the co-authors on that paper, Aleh Cherp, is with us here today to share insights on their work. We've also in the special issue had a variety of perspectives on topics like AI in climate innovation and the green industrial policy taking shape in the US under the IRA Act and so forth. There's lots more submissions under review, so watch this space to see this focus issue take shape. However, even with all these contributions to our wonderful special issue, there's still much that we don't know. And so we brought together 4 speakers today to help us understand different aspects of the future and historical energy transition. And I'm going to just briefly introduce what they're going to talk about by using arguably this is my favorite slide from the IPCC special report last year, showing on the top the dramatic cost reductions we've observed in photovoltaics and batteries for EVs, and on the bottom the rapid exponential diffusion of those low carbon technologies which we've observed as a result. So these dynamics around cost and diffusion are obviously an important part of what we've learned about historically in terms of how energy systems change, and what we need to understand even more so now into the low carbon future. So our 4 speakers aren't necessarily focusing on these 2 technologies, but I can use them to illustrate the kinds of questions that they're asking. Greene and Nemet are going to be exploring how country level characteristics impact these technology diffusion stories that we see on the left, looking at the influences of things like market characteristics, innovativeness, trade interdependence, and so forth. Nick Goedeking is going to be looking at the critical role played by institutions, including different types of policies and different types of political modes in shaping the kinds of accelerated decarbonisation that we see on the left. Aleh Cherp, as I've mentioned, is going to be sharing insights from a body of work looking at how the country variation in terms of the speed of energy system transitions observed historically can be used to give us greater insight into the kinds of speeds and transition dynamics which we will observe into the future. And then last but not least, we need to, particularly with respect to future energy transitions, need to be able to assess and model innovation dynamics in the kind of mitigation pathways. And so Roberto Pasqualino is going to share insights with us on that topic. And so here's the line out. I introduced that those speakers are actually in a slightly different order from how they're going to present today for time zone reasons. So here's how our session looks. And at this point, I will hand over to my colleague Radhika to introduce our first speaker.
Very helpful and very interesting to see the different things we're going to cover about, you know, how these transitions can take place, whether they're country level characteristics, institutions, thinking historically about how transitions have occurred in the past, and then modeling for the future. So to kick us off, we have Nicholas Goedeking, and Nick is a senior researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability and visiting researcher at the University of Sussex. His work examines the political economy of climate change and energy transitions, and he's interested in the politics of urban climate governance, public investment, green industrial policy. He's had multiple awards and fellowships, and before his doctorate, he worked on energy policy in Berlin and Brussels, and he holds a PhD in environmental science, policy and management from the University of California at Berkeley. So he's going to talk to us today about challenges for accelerating transitions. Nick, I'm going to give you 20 minutes for the presentation and then 10 minutes Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen, and do intervene if I go over. I do have the tendency to go over sometimes. So let me just share my screen here. All right. Can you guys see my screen? I think you should be able to see my screen. Okay, well, it's a great pleasure to be here. Today, I will be talking about challenges in accelerating multi-system transitions, specifically looking at evidence from transportation electrification of private passenger vehicles in Germany and California. It's a joint project with Caroline Rogge, and we really had two basic objectives that we wanted to pursue. The first was we wanted to empirically uncover like what's happening on the ground right now around transportation electrification in two countries that are often framed as climate policy leaders. And the second thing we wanted to achieve was we wanted to really move beyond individual single case studies. So the transitions community has done a lot of like work on single countries or single jurisdictions, but we feel, okay, it's really important to strengthen the generalizability of our insights by moving more into comparative designs. So what's the motivation of this piece? So, I mean, transportation is a really important sector. Most countries have adopted net zero targets foresee that electrification of transportation will have to play a really big role in this transition. It's obviously not the only technology or the only intervention that's important. Public transportation is important, densification, but the electrification of private vehicles certainly plays an important role. Germany and California have adopted very ambitious decarbonization targets, both aim to become net zero by 2045. Transportation factors into both of their strategies. We obviously see quite some differences in terms of, okay, their automotive incumbency in terms of their industrial structure, but we do see quite significant acceleration in the adoption of EVs per capita in both jurisdictions. That's kind of the point of the graph on the right. It is important, though, to emphasize that we're at the very, very beginning of this acceleration phase. So while we see significant changes in rates of change, if you look at the total amount of EVs, the share of EVs of the total vehicle population on the road, we're between 2 and 3%, right? So I think that's important to kind of acknowledge as well. What are acceleration challenges? Well, so we kind of start with a paper that was published in 2020 by Marquardt et al. That made the case that we're actually moving into a distinct phase now around certain clean technologies. So historically, transitions scholars have really looked at the emergence of niches, of small innovations, but we're starting to move into a phase where new technologies are entering the mass market. And they call this the acceleration phase. And they say that this phase is qualitatively quite distinct from the last 15 to 20 years in a number of ways. And they kind of outline in their view, 5 things that we should be expecting to unfold on the ground. Some of these categories are very difficult to define because they're quite high level and fuzzy. This is something we really grappled with, but I think they do capture something distinct. So the first is whole system change. Basically, we're not just talking of the adoption of a single technology. The rollout of renewables means changes for the grids, changes in building technology, changes in the way that we use appliances. There's basically a lot happening at the same time. We start seeing these multi-system interactions. So historically, transportation and energy have been distinct systems. They're also governed distinctly by separate ministries, by separate types of companies. But now that they're kind of merging, all of this is kind of starting to interact. We're starting to see decline in resistance. So now that we're moving into a phase where EVs are really taking off, labor unions that rely on the manufacturing of combustion engines, they start really foreseeing the costs of that. So we start seeing resistance. And then there's other things such as changes in consumer practices and governance. And they basically took this paper as our starting point. And we tried to say, okay, let's do a deep dive into California and Germany and see, do we see this playing out? Might we be able to see some other dynamics? And what does this mean for moving forward? And what we find, our core argument really is we generally find evidence in support of their framework, although I think we add some nuance. But I think we find 3 additional challenges, which are actually quite important. So the first, we find a challenge that we call expansion and contestation. And I'll dig into this a little bit further, but it's kind of aiming at the dual nature of politics. So the literature has really focused on political conflict around costs, the distributional costs of new innovation. But now that we're starting to see technologies really scale, what we find is that there's a lot of contestation by startups, by future winners, by all sorts of new actors that are trying to kind of write the rules of the future game. So it's kind of the politics not of compensation of foreseen costs. It's kind of contestation around who gets to now decide the rules that will determine profits in the future. So it's kind of quite an important point. The second one is we see really significant international dynamics. I mean, when we were doing this study, the Inflation Reduction Act in the US was passed, and this has had profound implications for how Europe has, and the European Commission, for example, has thought about, okay, how do we need our own green industrial policy? How do we do this in terms of free trade? Very thorny questions. And the final point we find is that justice and equity really becomes a really important point, which is distinct again from compensating foreseen costs. So in the German context, for example, a lot of equity or a lot of concerns around resistance focuses on bailing out negatively impacted workers or communities. But justice and equity, at least in California, is much more about inclusion. Like, how can we make sure that there's not a backlash and that people that that are low income, that they can actually partake in this? This is just kind of an overview of the challenges which we then define. This will be more important in the actual paper, but I think I've kind of just covered this already. In terms of our methods, so how did we actually do this? So we really grappled with the question of like, how do we empirically approach this question? And we initially thought, okay, do we try to survey or try to really collect bottom-up data from users, governments, etc. But we quickly realized that because our dependent variable is just so large, we would have really run into a lot of sampling issues to make that representative. So we ultimately decided to do expert interviews, which we conducted in autumn 2022. I was based in California at the time, so I did about 19 interviews in California. Caroline Rogge, my co-author, she did the interviews in Germany. And we basically asked a really simple question. We said, okay, what in your view are the 2 to 3 most pressing issues, which if they were resolved, would help accelerate the widespread electrification of private vehicle transportation? So we tried to constrain both the phenomenon by not looking at buses or heavy duty or public transportation. We're just looking at EVs, and we wanted to get a sense of like, okay, folks, experts that have been looking at this for a while, what do they see? And we then did a bottom-up coding exercise where we then tried to identify, okay, are there challenge types? Do we see patterns? And then ultimately we did a comparative analysis to kind of tease out some similarities and differences. I'm not going to read this. I mean, I can hardly read this table myself. The main point is we find about, I mean, there's methodologically like boundary issues that we encounter, like where does a challenge begin and end, and how do you make sense of that? We ultimately decided on, to make it digestible and manageable, about 55 or so challenges per jurisdiction. And this will be much more intelligible in the actual paper. And what we basically then do in the analysis, we kind of uncover that there's a set of challenges that are shared by both Germany and California. There's a set of challenges that's quite unique to Germany. There's a third set of challenges that are unique to California. And ultimately, we try to understand, well, what might explain the similarities and differences? And again, what does this mean for our understanding of the acceleration phase? So taking a look at like, what are some of the challenges that are shared? A lot of these shouldn't come as a surprise. So we found a lot of agreement across jurisdictions, across these two very different places around supply chain issues, both on the vehicle and the grid side concerning, let's say, charging infrastructure. And again, this might have been because of the post-pandemic paradigm of just general supply chain issues and global supply chains. But there seems to be something about that. This was basically a universal phenomenon. A second universal phenomenon was just the higher upfront costs of EVs compared to combustion engines. Again, that isn't really a surprise. Batteries are expensive everywhere, basically. We also see that there's a concerted effort in both places to onshore battery production capacity, right? So I think at a very basic level, the automotive industry, historically, the value of the production process was in the motor. And we're generally seeing a shift from the value away from all the components of the motor to the battery and the data. And governments in Germany and in California are quite keen to try to capture that value in some way. And then finally, the grid plays a role in both places as well. Grids are really important. I'll get into this later in the talk, because the way that grids are financed is quite different in both places, and that has quite profound implications for how utilities think about these issues. But basically, overall, we say, okay, at a very basic level, we see a fairly similar basic problem structure that governments are trying to grapple with around transportation electrification. If you then look at, okay, what are some of the challenges that are unique to Germany? What we find is, okay, we find, again, this shouldn't be surprising either, but we find quite strong internal combustion engine incumbency. So it's just, it's a big sector with a million jobs in Germany. What's interesting though is that this really does then shape the German government's response to the challenge, right? So in many ways, the German policy mix follows industry preferences, and because the automotive industry is kind of torn on how to manage the risk around electrification, we see that uncertainty be mediated and extended by the policy mix. We also found some interesting things. So in California, no one really challenges the goals around charging infrastructure. So California has adopted a bunch of targets that are more or less ambitious, but no one is really challenging whether this number makes sense or not. Whereas in Germany, everyone's like, oh, it's too high, or people don't really, it's the wrong goal. That in itself is interesting because it suggests that the goals and instruments are just much more contested. And maybe a final debate, these are just examples, but a final debate that's quite unique to Germany is around these so-called e-fuels, which is like basically a framing to try to extend combustion engines, which has been promoted by the Ministry for Transportation. So overall, we see quite a contested mode of policymaking emerge during the acceleration phase. In California, debates are quite different. So they become much more technocratic in a way. One huge debate in California has been around who gets to own what component of the charging infrastructure. I'm not going to get into this, but basically it's about California utilities make their money with a guaranteed rate of return on capital investment. And so if they can declare charging infrastructure as capital investment, they make a lot of money on this. But as a result, charging companies might not be able to make so much money off of this. Relatedly, there's a lot of debates around rate design. Because the market in California, the electricity market isn't fully unbundled and rates are regulated, demand charges, which is basically it's the charge that tries to cover the cost of the grid, is quite contentious. We see debates around multifamily housing, and then we see a really big debate around equity and inclusion, which is distinct again from compensation for anticipated losses, which is a much more dominant theme in Germany. And so compared to Germany, we argue, okay, we see a much more technocratic mode of policymaking emerge in California. Another finding here is, this kind of goes back to the point I was making earlier of like, given the nature of the categories that we use, how do you even classify a challenge? Is it whole system change? Is it an interaction? We really grappled a lot with this question and ultimately found, or went through multiple rounds of coding to try to make sure that this is as consistently as possible. But it was basically not possible to clearly label individual challenges as one type or another. We see a lot of overlap. The most significant overlap was the expansion and contestation challenge. But I think this is important for us as scholars to remember that, you know, the empirical world doesn't always neatly fit into these typologies that we use. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that, some of our variables are quite thorny. I think we have to think a little bit more about what does this mean for the way we think about theory. Some ideas about future discussion. Well, okay. I think in general, we find evidence for the Marquardt piece. We add these 3 extra challenges. I think we find that, you know, the types themselves, or this framework that has been put forward now, it doesn't really, there's a lot of fuzziness in the real world. And I think that we might have to, maybe it's the wrong framing. We might have to think a little bit more about, okay, how do we cut challenges in a way that makes sense for policymakers? I think one idea that we have is, okay, maybe we should use the terminology or the types of categories that decision makers use, so that we can basically highlight agency in these challenges, as opposed to trying to derive inductive categories from the bottom. And then maybe the final point is, okay, we see quite similar. We see some challenges be quite similar, but we also see quite some variation in others. Now, the big question, obviously, okay, well, what could explain the variation in some of these challenges? And I think that there's 3 general potential explanations, which goes beyond what we can achieve in the paper, but I think which could inform future research. So the first is, okay, Germany simply has greater OEM incumbency, and we see that being mediated by its regulatory apparatus. That is true to an extent, I think, because California, given provisions under the Clean Air Act, is a battleground for U.S. automotive companies as well. And we've seen significant resistance from the American OEMs in California as well. So that it's part of the story, but it is not the full story. The second potential explanation is, okay, might this just simply be the result of California's stronger regulatory institutions? So in Germany, a lot of this policy is being implemented by ministries, and these are led by elected officials. And as a result, a lot of what these ministries do is basically it's shaped by party and coalition politics. California's architecture for implementing electric vehicle policy is governed under the Clean Air Act, which means that California's Air Resources Board is the institution that actually does a lot of this policy. And these are not elected officials; these are technocrats, and that it kind of it insulates. This is kind of the theory, I think, that we have. It insulates the design and the implementation of policy to a greater extent from the influence of special interests. And the third potential explanation, which will also certainly play a role, is just simply the way that electricity is regulated and governed in both places is quite different. So this is something that I mentioned earlier, but utilities in California, they don't make their money by selling electricity. They make their money by making a guarantee rate return on capital investment. Utilities in Germany, they have to recover they have to recover capital investments through the sale of electricity. And so it kind of, if you can declare, if in California you can declare charging infrastructure as capital investment, utilities make an instant profit. So they really like that. And in Germany, they have to recover the cost by selling electricity, and that's really hard. And so we see this significant difference in a very powerful actor, namely utilities, play quite a different role. In California, utilities are very supportive of all of this. In Germany, they're quite reluctant because they don't really want to burn any money. I
Nick,
have, I think, like one more minute.
Yeah, you have another minute. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just gonna blast through this final slide. So what does this mean, I think, moving forward? I mean, I think that if there's like one key takeaway that is important, it's like that power market designs really shape these acceleration challenges. And the mechanism that is behind that is because the market design, it shapes, it determines who can make money how. It thereby shapes the preference of actors such as utilities, and it determines what even is an issue, right? So demand charges is a major issue in California, but the thing itself doesn't exist in Germany. And then maybe the final point, like what does this mean at a more abstract level? Well, I think we find that the Marquardt framework is quite agnostic to the role of political institutions, although this seems to play a really significant role. And maybe sector-specific institutions actually play a more important role than country-specific institutions, because we do see significant variation in market designs, not only across countries or jurisdictions, such as California and Germany, but even within the US, electricity is governed very differently. So we would expect quite some variation in the nature of the challenges within US states, within the US as well. I'll leave it at that, and yeah, look forward to your questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. That really, really interesting. So I might start off with a question and then hand it over to Charlie, who's going to help curate the Q&As from the audience and have some questions of his own. You know, one of the things that I was curious about was you had these challenges that were particular to Germany and some that were particular to California. And while they may not be shared with each other, they will probably be shared with other countries. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about both these are more sort of the social challenges, not the sort of technocratic ones, and not necessarily related to power market design. But I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the sort of the labor issue in Germany around existing jobs, and also the equity and justice issues that came up in California, because you've been talking about the technocratic challenges in California a lot, and you mentioned a little bit about equity and justice, but we didn't have a chance to go into that so much.
Yeah, those are great questions. I mean, so maybe just talking about labor issues. Labor issues are really quite distinct in both places. So in Germany, it's really the biggest labor interest group are the unions of the OEMs and the supplier industry. And the interesting about the unions is they're kind of torn. It's not that they're against this, but they also don't want to like I don't know, miss this opportunity. I mean, they see the writing on the wall, and so they're basically just asking for a lot of support. Labor issues in California are much more around, okay, how do we, like, unions have been lobbying a lot for making disbursement of, let's say, federal support for charging infrastructure contingent upon union labor, because it allows them to capture more of that money. So it's that's one difference between the two. In terms of the equity and justice issue, I mean, it's interesting that, I mean, the thing is, in California at least, even the equity and justice issues are governed as a technical, almost in a very technical way. So the way that it manifests itself in policymaking is, for instance, through the inclusion of income qualifications. So basically, like, you only qualify for certain types of programs depending on your income. And so a lot of debate is like, how do we calibrate that income? Again, it's very technical debate in many ways. The other issue is where this really comes up is around these multifamily housing, right? So you're more likely, it's like the first generation of EV owners, wealthy suburban folks who have a garage and they just kind of plug their thing in at home. Now that we're moving to the acceleration phase, what if you don't have your own parking space? Where do you charge? And so the fear in California is that as we enter this acceleration phase, a lot of these inequities are just exacerbated. And it's still, I mean, it's a very different historical context as well, right? And I think equity and justice play a bigger role in these terms in California at this stage than in Germany, certainly. But great question. Yeah, I could go on. Sorry.
Hi there. So I'm gonna take over and just pose you. We've got 3 questions from the audience, to relay to you, Nick. And I'm going to give you all 3 at once, as I know time's a little bit short. So they're all loosely related to generalizability. So the first question from N. Giresh is about how you selected your interview sample in both jurisdictions and whether the interviewees had similar kind of expertise and roles, which would then give you confidence about generalizing beyond those 2 jurisdictions. The next question from P. Shukra applied, well, and I'm sort of slightly paraphrasing, is the extent to which you can apply your insights on market power, market designs and so forth to other jurisdictions, particularly in the global south. So I mean, India and China as examples both have obviously very large EV sector, large and growing EV sectors. So are you aware of similar kind of issues there? And then a third and final question from Jay Norring in Norway is whether Norway, which I've seen characterized as having sort of tipped into EVs as the preference car choice at the point of sale, whether you saw similar issues around contestation and so forth in those markets.
Thank you for these great questions. So I'll just go through them really quickly. The first question is, okay, how do we select the interview sample? Okay, so the basic approach we did is, okay, we first tried to map out who do we think are the main players in this. And we just we brainstormed and we did a bunch of like background research, and we identified, for example, okay, we would expect the transport ministry to play a really important role. We would expect utility regulators to play an important role, utilities. We would expect EVSP, so electric vehicle service providers, basically charging networks, to play an important role. And we just tried to like map out who do we think are important, who's important, and then we tried to sample from all of these to not just bias the NGOs or not just talk to the regulator. And we tried to do this as consistently as possible. Does this mean? And then we used snowballing to dig further into these sectors, right? So once we talked to one EVSP, we were like, hey, could you maybe introduce us to someone else? And they were like, sure, and so forth and so forth. Is it fully reproducible? I mean, the nature of interviews makes that difficult, I think, but we try to be as comparative as we can in our sampling. The second question, okay, what might the insights on the role of market design mean for let's say India or China? I mean, so I think I would think that the general argument holds that market design overdetermines interests and thereby shapes politics. But I think a big difference that I would expect is that utilities in Europe are unbundled. In California, they're quasi-unbundled. It's a complicated story, but it's not fully unbundled. In China, it's a state-owned enterprise. That has huge implications for how interests are mediated and even who the interests are that play out. So I think the mechanism still holds. How it plays out, I don't know. I mean, that should be the next paper. So if you want to write it, go ahead. Take the idea and run with it. And then the third question was about, okay, Norway. I mean, Norway is really well researched. I think a big similarity between Norway and California, I think, is that they just invested a lot of money in this. And it takes time. It takes 20 years. This isn't going to happen overnight. But I'm not an expert on the Norway case. So I think there's debates on like what was the term? It's like comprehensive policy mixes. It's like you let's say if you look at the rollout of EVs, you're not just trying to increase the adoption of EVs, you also need to, let's say, increase the rollout of charging stations. So just supporting one or the other doesn't work. You have to do it at the same time. And actors in Germany, for instance, they constantly blame each other, like, oh, there's not enough cars or there's not enough charging stations. Unfortunately, in Germany, the regulators, that basically gets confused because they don't know who's right. But in effect, you have to do both. And so it's a very, it's a comprehensive policy mix. I mean, that's the short, simple answer. But yeah, it's a great question. Norway is certainly a very important case.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. That was really insightful. I wish we had more time, but we're going to have to move on. So I'm going to ask Roberto to come on the screen, which he's here. Fantastic. So Roberto Pasqualino is a fellow and a research associate in the Department of Land and Economy at Cambridge, and honorary research fellow at the Institute for Sustainable Resources at University College London, and is working on the science policy interface of support systems transformation towards a more just and sustainable society. His interdisciplinary background combines extensive training in complexity science, innovation theory, finance, mathematics, computer science, dynamic systems modeling, economics, and public policy. He's currently working in the Economics of Energy Innovation Systems Transition research project and serves as the co-lead on engagement in Brazil. So he's going to talk to us today about modeling induced innovation for low carbon energy transitions and provide us with a menu of options. So Roberto, you have about 20 minutes and then I will come back in.
Thank you very much, Radhika. Thanks so much for introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk about this work. It's very interesting as I have the chance to represent a lot of people in this paper that was submitted to the special issue that Charlie was talking about. As Radhika said, I work in Cambridge, part fellow also at UCL, and I work also at Nebraska University. So I kind of have the chance to represent a lot of people here, which is very good. A bit of funding of this work I'm also from Prisma. That is another project that basically supported with some people working on this particular paper. And yes, in comparison to what Nicolas said, not very focused on California, Germany case, very specific here. Instead, we go to the wider system. We look at system thinking. We look at the modeling of things. And specifically, we speak about how modeling-induced innovation for the low-carbon transition can make a difference. And we propose a menu of options about that from the EASE program. So the content, we start from the EASE program. So on your right, you see all the partners of the EASE programs that has been participating in this project, which are 16 in total: China, India, Brazil. We move into the research motivation and question, method, the typology of models, which is kind of the base of this piece of work, and this menu of options, which is at the end of the day a decision tree built up on top of a typology, and then the key findings. So, of course, the EASE program built up a lot of the work that we're going to present here. The project built up a lot of outputs across the various years. It started in 2020, is now 2023, is going to end at the end of the year. So we developed first risk opportunity analysis, the theory of it, the understanding of it, the empirical evidence of it, and then we moved towards the policy principle linked with that, which is the second report published in 2022. And then we end up into the models. So there's a lot of modeling around the EASE program. So the new economic models of energy innovation transition, I've been supporting that a lot with Oxford, so in particular Pete Barbrook and Fernanda Senra de Moura, and this work comes from there. You will see a lot of that. The next phase of the project is to build up other reports that will come up by the end of the years. And of course, we organized this in committee of practice. So there was a lot of engagements. As Radhika said, I was leading on the Brazil case, but then we also have other reports coming for China, India very soon. So let's get back into the paper. This paper talks about induced innovation. For those who don't know that, the definition comes from Hicks in 1932, very old story, which refers to the inventions that are induced by the changes in prices of the factors of production. In other words, if the prices of something changes, innovation somehow occurs because there's somebody starting the research development, starting decreasing prices somehow, and that innovation starts because of that. Still, the problem today is that many models keep innovation exogenous. They do that simply because it's complex to put that endogenously in the system, and at the same time they don't need to. Often they don't focus on that for whatever reason. So, but at the same time, what we believe is that if you actually put the innovation endogenous to the model, that changes everything. Simply, if you start the loop, which the more the price changes, the more innovation changes, and the more innovation they change the price, then you can act with a policy which can start disequilibrating system and send it towards a completely new state. So it's completely different. So the way of using policy linked to model-induced innovation can change completely the way of doing things into a mission-oriented manner rather than start just by cost benefits type of thinking. And for, of course, the low carbon energy transition, this is extremely, extremely important. We differentiate the model between those that are systemic and narrow. So the literature divides them quite clearly. So we have some narrow, which is, let's say, a learning curve, something very specific to look at. Instead, you end up into the very systemic thing when they try to look at the entire system without really much chance to look at the specific detail. But we try to look at those two distinctions into our paper specifically. And then what do? We know that in the IPCC, integrated assessment model, which are dominant in this field, they do model innovation. On the other hand, we also know that the assumption in them about equilibrium and optimality tends to create weaknesses, and that was basically reported in the assessment report 6, so in the IPCC working group 3. And of course, these models built exactly on the other side of the spectrum, which is the non-optimality and disequilibrium type. So that's why it makes sense to propose this. And the question comes like, can these EAST models provide valuable alternative to IPCC linked to policy? And can we propose this model in a way which is complementary against each other? So in the sense that often modelers tend to compete against each other for some reason. So they're trying to say, I can do this, I can do that, I can do everything. The other models is not good. I don't want that. So that's the point of this paper. I want to demonstrate that all the models can be put side by side. The usefulness of a model ends where the usefulness of another model begins. This is extremely important. And as a result, the EAST program was perfect to propose a menu of options against the IPCC integrated assessment models. So it doesn't criticize the IPCC models. We don't think there's a point of that. We simply propose, look, there are other models out there, and maybe they can be helpful to you as well. The methods, we started with a survey. So the beginning of the work for me was take a survey. We ended up talking to everybody in this program, China, India, Brazil, Europe as well. And we ended up with 24 models in the program. Extremely different. As you see, agent-based model, partial equilibrium, micro-simulation, data-driven, system dynamics, network. So you have all the type of models you can think of. And it becomes very hard to compare them and take the good out of them. So we use a survey. The survey is built up in 5 sections. In this paper, we just look at one section, which is about how they model technology. So how they model technology and how they do that. And when we ask this question, we ask them, how do you do that? Exogenous and endogenous, or R&D, or anything else? The answer was that only 6 models actually captured that, and they published that into the literature as today. And the 3 methods mainly are learning curves, R&D, and spillover effects. And of course, this paper then focused on just these 6 models. And out of these 6 models, we present only 4, just because FTT and the GIB model are basically modeling learning in a very similar way. And at the same time, the M3A3, which is the one on the bottom, and the DSK model that in the same way. So basically, we present only 4. There are 2 other pieces of work coming out of this survey. And yeah, based on that, we started on the literature review. We build up on the typology, which came up from the Barbrook Johnson et al. 2023, which is the new modeling report of this program that we published recently. And then basically this paper builds up on that, providing a decision tree on top of that typology, and you will see all about it in a minute. This is the typology of the Barbrook Johnson et al. 2023. So again, as I said, it was very hard to try to compare all the models in a meaningful way. The way which came more meaningful, and it was a lot of iteration about to create this type of framework with Oxford and all the team that you have mentioned at the very start, is that we end up breaking them between the data and static models and those that are simulation and dynamic models. And we draw a line between them. Clearly, this line is a dashed line because you cannot really draw a proper line because they are all connected among each other. You can connect them. Sometimes the models which are dynamic do a lot of effort on data. Often the model on data do a lot of effort to inform dynamic models. So as a result, the logic we try to explain for differentiating the two is that the data and static models are those that prioritize the data collection to then build a model, basically. And the data and dynamic model instead are those that first build the causal interpretation and then compare with the data. So it's a bit of a shift in mindset. The big difference that we found is that together with the increasing dynamic assumption inside of the model against this data structure, you grow in the concept of flexibility of running scenarios. And that's the key thing. So you end up from the very static, which we put here, system mapping. Stochastic experience curve, you have a bit more dynamics in the sense you start having bright lows or the cost reduction type thinking. Disequilibrium microeconometric, which is again an entire field of using input-output tables and exploring the disequilibrium into the economy with the econometric equation. And then we move into the dynamics. So future technology transformation, which is focused on the dynamic learning curve approaches, dynamic system, which includes, in our view, the IPCC integrated assessment models. And these are, let's say, higher order feedback systems that can include also innovation, of course, and then the agent-based models, which are, in our view, the best in class, but also most expensive in terms of computation. That's the menu of options we came up with. You will see this slide 4 or 5 times in this presentation, so don't worry if you don't read everything very quickly. I want to go quickly on that, but in practice, that's what we came up with. So it was a decision tree. If you start from the perspective of the policy analyst who is in troubles when he finds that there's a nonlinearity in the system, what do you do? How do you choose the model? Do you go straight away to the IPCC model because they are the only one available around the world? Or do you look around and you try to understand that every model is built for a purpose and you cannot answer every question with the same model? The entire problem that we try to solve is simply the many modelers, many policy people stretch the same models for answering questions they cannot answer because they are not designed to do that. So end up using optimization model to answer innovation question, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. And this actually tried to explain that in a very simple diagram. So build up on the so now we explore really the diagram. We place ourselves in the position of the analyst. The first question is, what do? Do you take a static approach or a dynamic approach? Let's say we go into the static approach. Do you have enough confidence in the understanding of the system to guide analysis of data? Now, the point is this. Sorry, that yes is supposed to be a no under the Q2.1, so it's a no. And if you don't have the answer, if you don't have enough confidence on how the system works, you go for system mapping. That's very, very important. It's basically the approach. So here we have a simple example of that, which is one of the case studies of, again, the new modeling report led by Cherp et al. So what did they do was like, let's do engagement, let's bring people together, let's do a bit of literature review, and we build a map. The map is let's try to see how the carbon tax can be approached in the context of China, in the context of innovation. They build up a reinforcing loop, which is about learning by doing. And they said, if you apply carbon tax, that carbon tax will somehow influence the reinforcing loop and speed up the transition. Look instead, if in the below diagram we have the ETS, emission trading scheme, that will create not just the reinforcing loop of the start, but also a balancing loop, and that will oppose the reinforcing loop of learning by doing. And as a result, it makes more sense, according to this study, that carbon tax is applied instead of ETS. It's more influential. The policy question used here is what is the most cost-effective option? They said it's carbon tax. And clearly the advantages is that breaks barrier between people for engagement, communicate much easier. It can be used as a starting point for updating other models, as well as, building the confidence in the system to start digging into the data if you really want to, because you cannot just analyze data without understanding the system. That's the key point. Sounds like very basic, but is extremely important. And in our view, is really the beginning of every single modeling and policy analysis. So here we are, we went towards the left side. Now from the question 2.1, we go to the question 2.2, which is the focus on the probabilistic analysis of learning curves or impact on water system structures. So that's what we do. We move into, we are confident now, we have enough system understanding to guide analysis of data, and we want to focus on learning curve, let's say. And here it is. We have the stochastic experience curve coming out from the project. That's what they did. This is again another example. There might be hundreds of learning curve applications. This one is a probabilistic case. And what they did was simply to demonstrate that very often integrated assessment models input in their models the not very updated data linked to the not very optimistic forecast about how cost might evolve in the future for a lot of different technologies. And what you see in the top chart is that most models, most integrated assessment models are the green line or the red and blue line, and they almost never end up demonstrating or picking the right cost in comparison to how that could evolve. So they start picking a number. So the green in particular chart, so chart B, the start of the horizontal green line is what the integrated assessment models in that report assumed as a possible cost at the time. Of course, it was much, much, much lower as a forecast. So much higher as a forecast, and in reality the cost reduction went much lower, much lower. And even applying the probabilistic curves, none of these models were actually assuming even the higher range of the actual cost forecast that this approach could envisage. Again, it's very powerful for communication. It's very simple, can be used as input to other models, and by itself gives evidence. And that's what we call as well as a narrow approach, just because it is focused on the specifics aspect of some models that can become a big system of the entire systemic picture. Again, I skip this equilibrium macroeconometric just because it goes integrated with the IFTT. And what we do here is second stage. From static, let's say we go to the dynamic. So we go on the right side into simulation dynamic models. And the idea is you want dynamic models, and you focus on the learning curve, dynamics of learning curve. Again, in this case, the future technology transformation suite of models is built on that. In this particular case, the E3ME FTT focus on is a dynamic model, has the big advantage of applying all the policies. You cannot do that in the other models we showed before. So we build up in complexity, but at the same time we build up in the ability to compare the model with data. We test tipping points, and we compare this model with the E3ME. We connect the E3ME model. So in practice, you can look at the dynamics of the transition. This one is an electric vehicle type case study, demonstrating that you can explore with policy the tipping points of expanding EV market in China, India, and Brazil. And then, yes, more complexity, more expansion. You have a dynamic system, and you can now test things. This thing can be integrated with what we saw before. So you do system mapping to explore what you want to model, and you do maybe learning curve to inform this model to maybe some specific relationship to explore the dynamic of the transition. Next phase, we didn't. So let's say we don't want to go more beyond the learning curve dynamics, which is the key feature of FTT. We want to go into the wider feedback system models, and in that case, we start asking the question: do you want an aggregated system or a disaggregated heterogeneous agent type of system? I'm not going in the IPCC because they're simply many, so I don't want to speak about them, and I assume people know about that. So we go into agent-based case, which was key in our project. So we go into agent-based modeling because
Roberto, you have a minute or two more.
Oh, thank you. Perfect timing. And here it is. We have this one is the DESK model. We have a large, more complex model, integrates environment, economy, tests a lot more policies. It creates much more funny scenario as well. For example, in this case is considers you have a dice scenario, so the integrated assessment model by the classic one, let's say, and look at the income, the impact on the economy, increase unemployment forever. And instead, if you apply a carbon tax, too strong carbon tax, you can create so much instability, and you have the red line there. And the result is that here you model much more dynamic system. You can model clusters of technology, spillovers becomes much more dynamic, and you can explore dynamic of tipping point scenarios in both negative and positive terms for the economy. And that's kind of supposed to inform the economic system, even though this one is more challenging result for validation with data. But the paper includes an appendix explaining how this model can be validated against data. So here it is. That's our menu of options. We hope that it's going to be interesting. The important thing to stress also is that all of the model you see at the bottom side can be integrated among each other, can be used to form each other, and that's or the dashed line between them at the bottom. So the key finding conclusion: only 25% of the models surveyed include innovation. Induced and endogenous. And of course, this might be the case because we end up talking to countries across the world. Most integrated assessment models are actually relying on European organizations. But at the same time, we feel that this is a problem, and this report, this paper is supposed also to help these people to learn how to include these dynamics in their model. System mapping emerges as a key approach to modeling and engagement. We love that. We feel is very important. It's the first step of the risk opportunity analysis framework, in fact, and by itself can be used as a standalone application, more of a network type, more data type, or also as an input to other models. The key thing is really that there are different ways of modeling innovation, R&D, and spillovers, and depending on the type of approach one wants to use, I have to go for a narrow or a systemic approach to modeling, and that's kind of emerging from the result of this paper.
Roberto, I think we have to quickly finish, huh?
Okay, thank you. And finally, what we can say is that, and that's what the paper was advocating for, the models can be integrated among each other, can be complementary among each other. They don't have to compete against each other all the time, particularly if they cover different policy questions, and in particular if they have different modeling approaches between static and dynamic. And I think that's it. Thanks so much. This is the references for this presentation, and thank you very much for your attention, and looking forward to get any question you might have. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Roberto. I have a question, and then I will hand it over to Charlie. And so my question is, it's kind of a bigger question. It's less about the details of the modeling itself, but I was wondering that given this development of this extensive menu of options, that you've been working on, what are the kind of biggest insights we'd get from that about the sorts of technology transitions that we're interested in?
So definitely, this is very, very important. The main logic is that all the models somehow agree among each other on the fact that in innovating the economy and assuming that innovation matters will influence the system, will bring it to lower cost over time. Okay, so they are completely different in approaches, but they all agree on this thing, and they also agree on the fact that it's going to be cheaper and it's going to be bringing to more stable economy, including economic growth potential and things like that. For the technology, of course, we have, for example, the stochastic experience curve model was applied to 50 different type of technologies and demonstrate that the cost is declining for all of them. Other models look at more how these type of, let's say, single technology can influence the wider system. So definitely there is a match there between those that are more systemic, so those that will look at the entire picture, so you can apply them more on a managerial level, for example, to talk to policy, and those which are much more narrow. And then, of course, you have an entire continuous type, in the sense from the stochastic learning curve to the dynamic learning curve. You already have the ability to start capturing the dynamics of that and explain how they work. So all together, they can basically explain the transition much better than each model puts separated from the others. Thank you.
So a question for me, actually, Roberto, is you presented this menu of options in terms of helping choose between the various models on offer, but I was wondering, to whom is this menu of options addressed? Is it to kind of us in the scientific community? Is it to folk working in government departments with policy roles and so forth? And if in part it's the latter, if in part your work helps inform policy applied modeling, then what's your experience working with policymakers in terms of their capacity to run complex models of the types that you were talking about?
Very much. That's an amazing question, actually. So we try to be clear on the paper that the key audience are the policy analysts, so those working for the government, potentially, because we feel, and there is a lot of demand, so in East we end up talking a lot with governments, Brazil, China, India. I was more focused on the Brazil case, so I know more about that. And there was a huge demand for models, but they don't know what to do. When we end up with a new model, they're like, what the hell am I doing with that? Let's go back to the model I used to use before, because I knew them. That happened in the European case. So when we end up interviewing people in the European Commission, that was really key in basically strong barrier, let's say, to let an agent-based model to penetrate any policy decision at all. So they always go for the same model because they know the models. In Brazil, they were more interested, just because maybe they are a bit more heterodox type. I don't know, there's a bit more of that kind of culture. And at the same time, we were a bit facilitated by the fact that there was a new government election in the 2022, and they were a lot more interested in this type of modeling. So that was clearly the case. So in that case, in Brazil, there were less barriers, I would say, even though at the same time they keep asking questions about how simple, how costly it's going to be for me to use that type of model instead of what I'm used to use. Okay. So yeah, clearly the agent-based models we were talking about tend to be more difficult to sell, even though at the same time they're the one which brings more interesting stuff, and they got the interest of people. And they normally get the interest just because the previous model, so for example, the learning curve model, is amazing for communicating specific results, but then you have limitation in terms of simulating things. You cannot simulate scenarios, and that's what they need. They need to implement the policies in the system. So again, that's also another big part that we did in EAST to try to understand how models inform policy. That is going to be the next paper from Sergey that works in Prisma. And that's very, very important to, let's say, help the engagement with the policymaker. So we don't, when we go talk to the policymaker, we never speak about the methodology of the models. We speak about the policy questions, try to ask and help them get into the right model that answer that question. So again, this one came mainly as a build up on the new modeling new economic modeling report, and there was a lot of demand for these people to understand how they choose the models. That's about it. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Shall we
Is there
move
any
on?
question?
Yeah. Are there
No
any?
other questions. Too much modeling.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Roberto. We're right on time to move on to our next speaker. So I would like to ask Aleh Cherp to come on the screen. Hi, Aleh. So Aleh is a professor at the Central European University in Austria and Lund University in Sweden. His interests include energy security, multidisciplinary perspectives on energy transitions, and feasibility of climate action. He co-leads the work on feasibility of climate mitigation pathways in ENGAGE and on non-technical feasibility of low-carbon electrification in Sweden and Northern Europe in the Mistra Electric project. So in the past, he has served as coordinating lead author on energy security in the Global Energy Assessment, and he co-leads the Perspectives on Technological Change and Energy Transitions Inter-University Research Group. So he's going to be speaking with us about the speed of national transitions and feasibility of climate mitigation pathways. So learning a little bit from the past, from what I understand. So thanks so much, Aleh. I'll turn it over to you. That's 20 minutes. And then there'll be questions after.
Thank you, Radhika. Great to be here. I would like to mention in the beginning that different from the previous speakers, I would focus very much on the national transitions and how it relates to the future global change, and that I also have co-authors who are present here as speakers with whom we prepared this manuscript I'm going to describe, and some other papers I'm going to refer to. Now, the question I'm asking is very much similar to the questions other presenters asked, and this is how fast can technologies grow? You can see that they should grow pretty fast in order to achieve the climate targets, for example, in these net zero scenarios. And the technologies that grow fastest are solar and wind power, and also nuclear power has to grow fast. So we focus on these three technologies, and we try to figure out whether this growth is feasible. But before we answer this question, how fast can technology grow, we should also ask the question, how do they grow? What drives the technological growth? And here there are very big mechanisms, very high-level mechanisms if we consider. One mechanism is technological innovation, of how technologies themselves become cheaper, more effective, suitable for more conditions, etc. And the second mechanism is the social-political context, which affects how technologies grow in individual countries, and it involves a lot of things like markets and social choices, but it also involves political choices. Now, we start with remarking one phenomenon, technological growth, and this is something which technology scholars were interested for decades, is how technologies diffuse from frontrunners to latecomers. Almost all technologies, they don't appear simultaneously in the entire world. They appear first in some countries which have better conditions, and then they diffuse to countries with slightly worse conditions. And this is, of course, also affected by technological innovation and by social, technical, political context. So we do this analysis where we look at largest countries which account for 95% of global electricity. And you can see here which countries use which technologies. You can see the orange line encompassing countries which use solar, and blue for wind, and lilac for nuclear. And eventually two or three remarks which are obvious from this simple analysis is that almost all low carbon technologies are used in almost all countries. So there is no big competition. A lot of countries can use these technologies, and basically that leads us to assumptions that maybe in the future all countries can use these technologies. But there is one exception, and this exception are fossil fuel exporters. You can see that fossil fuel exporters don't use low carbon technologies or use only one of them, which basically for us means that political motivation at this very high national level is very important for adoption of technologies. We can also see that nuclear is used in a smaller number of countries, and this is actually very easy to explain by the fact that it is smaller countries which use nuclear. Here I'm pointing to larger countries counterintuitively, but it's smaller countries that don't use nuclear. Now, what happens after the technology is introduced? After the technology is introduced, as Nicholas already said, it starts growing. And it grows along this S-curve, right? So that there is acceleration, and then there is gradual slowdown. And of course, this growth is also affected by technological innovation and social political context. So we can expect it to happen different in different countries, but also to follow some global level regularities. So now, what do we know about S-curves? And this is once again, it would be very useful for me to build on what Nicholas explained about S-curve, but I will put slightly different emphasis on what is acceleration and other phases. Indeed, the first technologies along S-curve, they are accelerating, and this is because of positive feedback loops of increasing returns, as technology diffusion scholars say. So, for example, the more you use the technology, the lower is the cost. The lower is the cost, the fastest is grow, and then you more use it, etc. So it drives something which some people call exponential growth. It may not be exponential, but at least it is accelerating. Every year you have faster growth. Now, where many technologies are now are actually not this acceleration phase, but this is what we call stable growth phase. And this is in the middle of the S-curve, where the growth rate may be very high, but it is no longer increasing. And then finally, technologies are stabilizing. We see it with nuclear energy, they don't grow any longer. Now, an interesting way to look at this is to look at the rate of growth rather than cumulative deployment of technology. So you can see accelerating growth, the growth rate increases, then it achieves its maximum, and then it starts decreasing. And in our article that we published about 2 years ago in Nature Energy, we developed a method of how to compare this nonlinear development across countries by measuring the maximum growth rate at the inflection point, and then using it as a proxy for the maximum growth rates in larger regions and in the future. Now, so what we do in this article is that we make a lot of these curves. We analyze each country, we see which countries achieve this stable growth, and then we measure it, and then we analyze what it depends upon and what are the ranges. And here, what I'm presenting today, we are doing the same not only for wind and solar, but we are also doing the same for nuclear. On this graph, every dot represents a country, and on the vertical axis, we see the rate of growth expressed as percentage of electricity system for this country, and on the horizontal axis is how big is electricity supply in the country to differentiate between small and large countries. Here you see countries which develop nuclear fastest, and here you see countries which develop wind and solar faster. Now, we can also look not only at individual countries, but at large regions. For example, here we look at Europe, and you can see that large regions understandably don't have as high growth rates as individual countries because they comprise of diverse countries, and they eventually average, integrate these growth rates from fast countries and slower countries so that they grow slower, and the world also grows slower, of course, than individual regions. So these are important insights for constructing future scenarios. Now, basically, this already allows us to make statistics, to make median and interquartile ranges of this growth, and then try to use them for scenarios. But there are two important qualifications which we need to address first. One qualification is that you can see some of these are circles and some of these are crosses. And the crosses, they mean that the technology in this country or region or globally has not yet achieved its stable growth rate. It's still accelerating. And therefore, we cannot use this as a true estimate of future maximum growth rate, right? So in principle, it might be that these crosses, they will become circles somewhere here, right? Or these crosses, they will become circles here. That's why we compare technology growth rates between so-called latecomers or front runners. And here the literature comes with two conflicting hypotheses. One hypothesis is that technological innovation makes it so that latecomers develop technologies faster than front runners because they learn, they don't need to make these mistakes to experiment and to learn for decades. They can just use this experience and grow it very fast. Now, another strain of literature actually observes that in latecomer markets, technologies develop not faster but slower than in early coming markets. And the logical explanation for this is very simple, that the same factors which delay the introduction of a technology in the market would also slow down its growth rate. And there is no way theoretically to figure out which factors prevail, technological innovation or less favorable circumstances, so that we actually do an empirical analysis of this. And what we do, we show that in latecomer countries, it looks like wind and solar actually grow slower, not faster than in front runners. So that basically the benefits of technological learning, they are cancelled out by less favorable social economic circumstances for these politically driven technologies. These are, of course, very bad news for climate, but these are very good news for our research, because then we can use the rates in front commerce as a reasonable benchmark for future growth. We just need to look at Denmark, and then we can assume that it will be very difficult for other countries expanding wind power faster than Denmark. Okay, so what are the results here? Basically, I think I have to make one more qualification here. And qualification here results from a cheating in this slide. In this slide, you can look at it and you say, oh, nuclear grows faster than wind and solar. But this only is an illusion, because nuclear sample is drawn from very different social circumstances than wind and solar. Almost all nuclear points are drawn from Western Europe or other industrial countries which reacted to disruptions of electricity, of energy supply in the 1970s to the oil crisis, right? And almost all renewable thoughts are drawn from the situations where energy security was totally fine and electricity demand was not growing. So it would be really, really interesting here to see whether we can find a natural experiment that would expose renewables to an energy security crisis. And fortunately, we do have this experiment. It's called REPowerEU. It's a proposal that the European Commission made after Russia invaded Ukraine and Europe was on the face of severe energy security crisis. You can see that REPowerEU actually proposes to increase the growth of wind and solar power in the European Union far beyond the historical rates and almost comparable to the expansion of nuclear that followed the oil crisis, which is very interesting. It looks that under similar circumstances, we have similar rates of growth even in very different time epochs for very different technologies. And it also allows us to formulate benchmarks for future scenarios. I already mentioned REPowerEU and the European oil crisis, but China also has nuclear plants, which we use as a benchmark. And we can also think that maybe non-nuclear growth is a reasonable benchmark. And we can also look at these national rates of growth and specify the Q3, the rate which is above 75% of all nations, and think that it is a reasonable benchmark, ambitious benchmark for future climate scenarios. Now, next thing we do, we look at all IPCC scenarios. There is more than 1,000. We group them according to the temperature category, and we measure maximum 10-year growth rates between 2020 and 2040. So these are very near-term growth rates. And you can see that these growth rates are, of course, higher for all low-carbon technologies combined for scenarios which aim for stricter temperature targets. They are also much higher in Asia than OECD, because Asia has most of the emissions it has to decarbonize faster. So how does it compare with our empirical benchmarks? Let's first take the most ambitious benchmarks. Let's imagine that Asia would develop nuclear as fast as Europe developed after the oil crisis. Plus, it will develop solar and wind as fast as Europe now plans to develop after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we can see that in this situation, you can actually meet 1.5 degree standard. Now, more realistic would be that Asia would have this very ambitious Q3 of national rates. And this is ambitious because, first of all, Asia is an enormous region. And as I just mentioned, regions usually develop slower than individual countries. The second ambitious aspect of it is that Asia has a lot of latecomer countries. As I mentioned, latecomer countries are not very likely to develop faster than frontrunner countries. So Vietnam is not very likely to develop faster than Denmark, in other words. And then you can see that you can actually meet the 2-degree target, but it's more difficult for 1.5. Well, in another experiment, mental experiment that we make, that we assume no nuclear growth, but very ambitious renewable growth. And then once again, we are within 2 degrees, but much lower than 1.5 degrees scenarios. Now, the same experiment can be extended to OECD countries, these are rich industrial countries, and you can see that in this case, you can actually probably meet 1.5 degree even without nuclear, even if there is no growth to nuclear. But in this discussion, you can see how heavy I rely on REPowerEU, that this is something feasible. And REPowerEU, let me remind you, is not something we observe, it's just a plan. And so that we can ask, well, whether this plan is realistic or whether this is simply a dream of European bureaucrats. REPowerEU focuses on developing solar and onshore and offshore wind, but the bulk of the growth comes from onshore wind. So I'll just illustrate our way of thinking into looking more closely into onshore wind. Here is historical onshore wind. These are annual additions in Europe. And you can see that this is not accelerated growth phase. This is a stable growth phase, right? It grows quite fast, but it doesn't grow faster and faster, right? Now, where does REPowerEU here? Well, it looks like that. This is REPowerEU and also IEA projections. So you can see this is something very, very unusual. If you look at the last 15 years or 20 years of development, what REPowerEU tries to do with onshore wind power. But if you compare with nuclear, that may look kind of similar. So maybe we should just look in 1970s and see what did we do in 1970s, 1980s. Maybe we should do the same and do the same magic for onshore wind as we did for nuclear in the 1980s in Europe. To test this, let me come back to the S-curve, right? Remind you that we have this inverse U shape of growth, which we expect. And let's now fit empirical data to this theoretical model. And you can see this is a theoretical U-shaped model for onshore wind generation growth in Europe. You can see it's a nice U-shaped curve, right, if you fit it. And nuclear also followed the U-shaped curve, which is approximately same time characteristics, but much higher at the peak than onshore wind. So how does REPowerEU fit here? Well, that's REPowerEU. And as soon as you make this drawing, you can see that we can learn very little from nuclear, because nuclear was truly, at this point, accelerating, and all you needed to do is to maintain and multiply this acceleration. Onshore wind already ran into significant barriers, and these barriers are increasing with deployment, not decreasing, right? So this is, I think, a big insight and a big debate. So that instead of accelerating acceleration, we need to find and remove these barriers. Then what are these barriers? And this is, of course, not the subject, not something I want to discuss today. But just to give you some insight, we are doing empirical research trying to identify these barriers, and most of them come from conflicting land uses. Basically, there are other ideas of how land can be used than for building onshore wind. For example, this is a protest in northern Norway against large wind power farms, and these similar protests are also in the global south. And you can say, well, these are just social protests, just ignore them, right? This is existential threat, you can ignore them. Well, it's not that easy to ignore in democracies. In 2021, in Sweden, 80% of all wind power proposals were rejected, not by protests, but by local communities. They didn't issue planning permissions. And as a result, Sweden used to have the fastest growth of onshore wind in Europe. It will probably come to a halt in the next 2 years. There is simply no more willingness to accept it. So we have to do something with it, and nuclear, unfortunately, cannot help. Nuclear had never had to do with this massive social resistance that is rejecting 80% of proposals. Now, let me now make some reflections and just show how this research may be applicable on a wider scale. There are two ways to approach the futures in the global climate and energy community. And one way is nicely illustrated now by Roberto, is structured around integrated assessment models and scenarios based on these models. So what they try to do, they try to model causal mechanisms. Roberto talked a lot about how they model learning curves. Then there are some policy choices which are assumed. And Roberto mentioned carbon tax, for example. And then based on this, you have plausible scenarios. Now, the problems with it is that, of course, you cannot model all social mechanisms. You cannot model social resistance or whether Swedish communities or municipalities will approve wind projects. You cannot assume policy choices which are realistic. You can assume, but it will be very difficult to say why 200 euro carbon tax is realistic, but not 600 euro. And then with plausible scenarios, you can of course generate thousands of scenarios, but because you don't know which assumptions are realistic, you will never be able to say, oh, this scenario is more likely than the other scenario. Now, so that to address these weaknesses, there is another approach, which is based on historical analogies, which analyzes the outcomes of similar reference cases. It doesn't assume that climate change is completely unique. It says, well, we did similar things in the past. And then we can look at what were the outcomes, because they will capture balance of all factors, those that we can model, those that we cannot model, and those which we cannot even observe. They will be captured in these outcomes. And then you will automatically get the probability of scenarios. How often energy transition succeed or fail will simply be manifested in the outcomes of reference cases. Of course, it also has weaknesses. What if the future is radically different from reference cases? If you notice success or failure, what were the mechanisms and the policy choices that led to this success or failures? Now, what we actually were inspired to is the scholarship of Nobel Prize winner in economics Daniel Kahneman, which called these two ways of looking into the future, the inside view and the outside view. And he remarked that people are strongly biased in favor of the inside view of the complex models because they look very serious attempts to come up with the challenge of climate mitigation.
You have a minute
However,
left.
he also observed that the outside view is actually more likely to give realistic estimate. That's why we really wanted to bring together the inside and the outside view. And this is what I just did. And it is based on the article that I published with Jessica Jewell, which is exactly about bridging outside and inside views through the feasibility spaces, where we use plausible scenarios and causal mechanism from the inside view, and we look at the outcomes of reference cases from the outside view. And as a result, we come up with feasible scenarios and with model policy strategies.
Aleh?
Now, let me just conclude with a few points. One is that if you want to understand future technology growth, you need to understand causal mechanisms. So what will lead to the growth, whether it is just cost reduction or whether there are other things, plausible scenarios, and also outcomes of reference cases. Now, what we demonstrate is that the growth of technologies depends not only what kind of technology it is, whether it is lumpy and expensive as nuclear or whether it is granular and cheap as solar, but also under what social and political conditions they grow. When you want to draw lessons from these reference cases, you should account for the phase of the S-curve. And once again, the scholarship that differentiates between various phases is very useful here, except that probably, in our opinion, we are not in acceleration phase for some technologies any longer. We are in the stable linear growth phase. And that means that we need to attend to the barriers which slow down the growth rather than simply to mechanisms which can speed it up. Finally, what I wanted to remark, I wanted to bring your attention to this concept of the inside and the outside view and how it can be bridged to develop better understanding of technological futures. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aleh. So yeah, really, really interesting. I have a question, and I was struck by. Are you still there? Okay. Is there a way to bring him back? Okay. Right. Okay. So I think we lost Aleh before we could ask him all of our questions, which is too bad.
Radhika, I think that some of Aleh's co-authors are possibly in the audience, and so maybe if it's possible, if people in the audience have questions, they can still post them, and perhaps if Jessica or Vadim or other Aleh colleagues are in the audience, they can answer them in the Q&A.
Perfect. So I think, Charlie, you'll have to monitor that because I can't see the Q&A. But I see we have over 50 people online listening in right now. So do type your questions anyway. And also, if any of Aleh's co-authors are there and can write in the chat, that would be great because we would love to have a chance to still go over the Q&As. Anything?
So there's one question in the discussion forum from Fidelino, who's from Timor-Leste. And it was a question about Southeast Asian countries with high use of non-electric vehicles. So I think it maybe was a question that was more related to Nick's talk earlier on. But the broad question is, actually, Radhika, you might be very well placed to answer this. That it's about the policies and concerns of investors in developed countries on climate change, and the extent to which that shapes the sort of energy transition dynamics in developing countries, in this particular example in Southeast Asia. There was also a question earlier that someone had posed during Nick's talk about the loss and damage function under the UNFCCC and the extent to which that was shaping investment priorities in global South economies, as opposed to, if you like, sort of more endogenous dynamics within those countries. So not specific questions, but I guess as it's me and you, do you have any good answers to that? Oh,
he's back. Perfect. Okay, great.
I was experimenting with technology, but I heard you all the time.
Good, Aleh. Great to have you back.
I'm a latecomer. Oh, no, I'm a front runner.
Well, yeah. Hopefully we'll
I heard everything.
Yeah. So, okay. So
no,
Charlie,
well, actually, maybe, but maybe I was not quite paying attention. So what was that about? Let me just check the Q&A.
Aleh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. So Charlie, is there anything from the audience for Aleh? Because we only have about 4 minutes or so.
Yeah.
So I'd like to get the questions in first.
Yes, no, not so far. So I definitely encourage the audience listening to post their questions in the Q&A. I've got a question I can start off with, or follow you if you like, Radhika.
No, go for it. Go for it.
So just a quick one from me, Aleh. Really fascinating talk, and I was really interested to see. So you presented the evidence around spillover from early adopting to latecomer countries, and then showed the evidence to actually, with respect to PV, wind, and nuclear, that actually the spillover effect does not help accelerate diffusion. I think actually there's a nice segue into Jenna and Greg's talk, which is following this. But my question on that was, are there conditions under which these spillover effects from early adopters to latecomer countries does help accelerate diffusion? And I'm thinking particularly of the sort of investments in institutional capacity that help countries absorb knowledge from the early adopters and then spin it out quickly into diffusion. Or that would be a question.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. That's a very good question. And we are actually doing now more extensive research. You noticed I presented for wind and solar, but not for nuclear, right? And we are now doing research on a wide variety of technologies. Avi Yakmola, who is here in the audience, is leading this research. So we are testing this hypothesis extremely thoroughly, and also, trying to control for various variables such as institutional capacity, without kind of disclosing a big surprise secret. I must say that there are situations when latecomers are faster, and it's usually not the periphery, but the sort of the rim of technologies. Like, for example, France would be faster introducing nuclear power than the front runner, which is the UK or the US, right? And that is because they would totally benefit from technological learning. They could just take it in, but they would have approximately the same institutions, right? So when it kind of diffuses to very similar countries, you can expect technological learning and innovation to prevail over adverse circumstances. When it diffuses to very different countries, then usually the very fact that these different countries adopted later also slows down the diffusion. So you can almost expect logically to be diffusion, at least not much faster.
Great. I might have just a really sort of quick follow-up on Charlie's question over a minute, Aleh, which is to say that I think the fact that latecomers grow slowly is, what is the sort of implication for that in terms of how we can possibly shift that trend, right? So Charlie talked, it's not so different to Charlie's question, actually, in terms of under what conditions can that look different? Because that would be important for global transition.
Yes. Well, I mean, one thing which might benefit latecomer countries is the better geography, especially in terms of solar. So that's kind of, I was saying, well, the conditions are worse. No, actually, sometimes they are better. But also very rapid electricity demand growth. And what I think now is shifting, and I didn't touch upon it, but I think Nicholas mentioned it, is that we are witnessing a very new era in low carbon electricity, because the demand will expand very rapidly if we move into decarbonizing transport and other sectors. And then, I mean, we don't have empirical data, but there is intuition that under this very fast demand growth, which will also be faster maybe in emerging markets, we can actually see faster rates, because they will be driven by this kind of, just very rapidly expanding demand. But then, of course, on the other hand, they will need to grow even faster because they would cancel this demand growth and also displace fossil fuels. The other conditions, I kind of, it's very, very sort of hard to say because we very frankly, like, we tried to identify why these maximum growth rates differ from one country to another, and we could not find a very, very good correlates for this, except that in the European Union, they seem to be higher, right? So maybe all countries should form little European unions around the world.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Aleh. We will move on to our final set of speakers, and I will ask them to come onto the stage. So we have, this is going to be a joint talk between Jenna Greene and Greg Nemet. And so I will quickly introduce them both. Jenna is a PhD in Environment and Resources at University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she focuses on the diffusion of low-carbon technologies. She did her Master's of Public Administration at UW-Madison and her BA at Carleton College. And before that, she was working at the Great Plains Institute, where she developed climate action strategies and solar readiness policies for local governments across the Midwest. Gregory Nemet is a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the La Follette School of Public Affairs, and his research focuses on understanding the processes of technological change and the ways in which public policy can affect it. He received an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, and he used that to write his book, which many of you have probably read, called, or if not, please read it, on how solar PV provides lessons for the development of other low-carbon technologies. And he was awarded the inaugural World Citizen Prize in Environmental Performance in 2019 and is also lead author of the IPCC's 6th assessment report. So they're going to talk to us about technological characteristics and country contexts that affect technological diffusion. So 20 minutes, and then I will interrupt.
Thanks, Radhika. So yeah, I'm Greg Nemet. In a minute, I'll turn it over to Jenna Greene, who will be leading our presentation today, but really interesting so far to see the other presentations by Nick on the cases and on models by Roberto. And Aleh's work most closely resembles the work from Jenna and me, although using different metrics and different technology examples to ask similar questions and some of the same research questions about what drives the speed of technology adoption and what drives later countries to go faster or slower. And I would say that our presentation is ultimately about knowledge spillovers. And it's really a question about how do agents, whether it's countries or companies or individuals, learn from each other. And I think that's a big factor. And that'd be probably my answer to the previous question about how we could actually get some of these slower countries to move faster. So to inform our discussion about knowledge spillovers, Jenna will talk about her work from a macro perspective, looking across many technologies and countries, and then I'll add a short perspective at the end from the micro of a deep dive of knowledge spillovers on one particular technology. So I'll turn it over now to Jenna Greene.
Thanks so much, Greg. Yeah, so my name is Jenna Greene. I'm a PhD student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I'll be talking about historical technology diffusion, like Greg said, at a macro level, and introduce some of the data that we've been using to inform the questions that we're asking. So generally, we're looking at historical technology diffusion to understand, firstly, how technologies have changed and grown over time in the past, and then that can inform our assumptions of how technologies might grow in the future. So of most interest to us is low carbon technologies that can help mitigate climate change. And we know that these technologies look quite different from one another. And so we look at a broad set of technologies that can inform our understanding of how these technologies might grow in the future. So to do that, with that motivation, I've spent the last couple of years at University of Wisconsin-Madison working with a few colleagues to assemble the Historical Adoption of Technology, or the HATCH data set. which is a data set of over 200 very diverse technologies. It's structured as a time series of technological adoption. And this is an intentionally broad set of technologies so that, like I mentioned earlier, we can have a broad set of analogs of which we can learn from when we think about what technologies might look like in the future for low carbon technologies. So this data set allows us to understand technology growth both over time historically and how it has differed across space. So this data set includes global technology growth and national level technology growth. Will be publicly available very soon. It'll be hosted at this link or a similar link very soon. So stay tuned for that data set to be public. So I'll present some kind of exploratory results from this data set and some questions that we now ask with this data. So first, when we look at global technology growth, this chart shows 148 technologies at the global level, and we divide them generally in technology categories. So we can see in this chart that across categories, technologies have grown quite differently from one another. So for example, infrastructure technologies have grown more slowly than digitalization technologies. But what this doesn't show us is why these growth rates differ. It just shows us that categorically technologies grow different from one another at the global level, but it brings up more questions as to why this is. And at the national level with the Hatch data set, this chart shows an example of about 60 technologies and how they've grown over time. And on the x-axis shows the first year of commercialization of each technologies, and then each dot is the growth rate in each country of those technologies. So the positive trend line here shows that technologies that have commercialized more recently have grown more quickly than technologies in the past. Other literature on this topic has found that this could be for reasons like globalization and digitalization. And our work hasn't looked into that, but just generally sees this trend in this broad set of technologies and doesn't yet show why. So with that motivation, we combine what we have in the Hatch data set, which shows us the speed of technology diffusion historically, with some other characteristics. So we've gathered data on technology characteristics and at the country level, the country context characteristics. So for technology characteristics, we've collected things like complexity, so the number of parts for each technology and the interactions between those parts, all the way to the type of adopter. So whether these technologies have been adopted by firms, by individuals, or by both. So beyond just the category that the technology is in, what about those technologies result in different growth rates? And then on the country level, these characteristics are both individually at the country level and between countries, the relationship between countries. So broadly, they're divided into three sets of variables. The first is economic, so things like the GDP of each country, R&D spending in each country, and then the relationship, the trade relationship between lead countries and other countries as well. And then political and institutional variables, like what type of government is in the country, the capacity of that government to pass and enforce policies, and membership in international organizations. And then lastly, sociocultural acceptance of new technologies. So are people generally open to new technologies, and whether that impacts the scale-up of technologies. So all of these factors then lead us to the question that was asked also in the previous talk, which is whether late adopters, whether technologies in late adopting countries grow faster or slower than in early adopters. So there are two general hypotheses, and I'll just go over those quickly. In the first case, late adopters might grow slower. So technologies in late adopting countries might grow slower than in the country where that technology was first commercialized. And this could be because of a couple of reasons. One might be because of weaker institutions in late adopting countries. So maybe it is less able to pass policies that could encourage scale up or less able to enforce those policies. Or it could be that there's less investment generally in technological growth and technological scale up in those countries. In the second case, late adopters might grow faster than early adopters. And this might be because of technological improvement. So after the technology has been commercialized in the lead country, there's been some improvement in that technology that then the later country can adopt, and that technology is improved in some way. And then the second reason could be this knowledge spillover effect, where the later adopting countries have learned from experience in early adopting countries. They know what works, they know what policies might work well to encourage rapid scale up. So using the Hatch data set, we can explore which of these cases we see more commonly, and then which technology characteristics and which country characteristics might lead to either case one or case two. So this chart shows just a glimpse of some of the technologies in the Hatch data set, again at the national level. And here a positive trend line indicates that follower countries grow faster, or late adopting countries grow faster than early adopting countries. And a negative sloping line indicates the opposite, that later adopting countries grow more slowly than early adopting countries. And we generally see across this very wide range of technologies that technology diffusion happens faster in later adopting countries. So more often we see a positive line here on these charts, but we see a difference in both the slopes of those lines, whether it's positive or negative, and the magnitude of that difference. So how much faster or slower a late adopting country grows than an early adopting country. And I'll just pull out two examples here of the cases that I presented earlier. So for nuclear energy, we see that later adopting countries grow more slowly than early adopting countries with that negative line, versus televisions, which is the opposite, where later adopting countries grow more quickly than early adopting countries. And intuitively, we know that nuclear energy and televisions are very different types of technologies. But with a wide range of technologies available in this data set, we can explore what about those technologies allow both for fast diffusion speed, but also this difference between early and late adopting countries and the magnitude of that difference. And then we can use the country characteristics to explore the difference in the speed of adoption across countries. So in the future with this work, we're moving forward with our empirical analysis of those technology characteristics and country characteristics, both broadly to understand diffusion speed historically, and more specifically on this knowledge spillover effect between early adopting and late adopting countries. The work I've presented is quite high level, quite macro and broad across these large suite of technologies, which can allow us to have a broad set of analogs for low carbon technologies in the future. But it's helpful to pair that as well with deeper historical analyses of individual technologies. So I'll turn it over to Greg Nemet now to talk more specifically about the case of solar.
Thanks, Jenna. So yeah, really nice to have the comparison of Jenna's mountain of work over the last couple of years, putting these hundreds of technologies together, and then connecting that to a deep dive in one. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just briefly talk about what knowledge spillovers look like in a single technology, which is solar. And some of the main insights from taking a deep dive at the cost of solar over time is, one, that no country did it, that it was a relay race of innovations passed from one country to another. No company ever maintained a lead for more than a couple of years. It was really a relay race of one country building on the strengths of another country. The concept of national innovation systems was really helpful in understanding these patterns of activity here, because each country contributed something distinct, whether it's about developing technical competence or creating markets for technology or optimizing manufacturing to get the costs out. And all of the countries that appear on this slide played a role in that. And I think it also makes us wonder about how to say who is the first country, because the first country that may have commercialized the technology is not going to be necessarily the leader on the technology throughout the period in which we're interested in the development and growth of it. And the second part that just looms large on solar is just how crucial knowledge spillovers were throughout this pattern here. And it's countries learning from another, it's policymakers learning from other policymakers, it's companies relocating their activities in different countries to chase after policies that were attractive at certain times. And crucially, it was individuals who have tacit knowledge in their own heads that are emerging in one place, getting educated in another place, pursuing a career in the third place, and then moving around the world to develop a supply chain, for example. And that happened multiple times in the solar industry. So if we go to the next slide, just to show a couple more illustrations of this same idea, if we just look at Germany and maybe push ahead one more prompt here, one of the first things that emerged is a policy window. So this is more of a political science concept when there's a possibility of enacting a radical or important legislation. It happened. It was only available for a couple of years when the Green Party and the Social Democrats held power, but they were ready to go at the time. Next, and then just to show where those policies, they used their policy window to adopt policies that had been proven in other places. There was a guaranteed power purchase agreement developed in California for wind power in the 1980s. And there was a consumer rebate program developed in Japan in the 1990s. And with the renewable energy law and the feed-in tariff developed in Germany, the Germans borrowed both of those concepts and bolstered them. They made the rate much higher, and they made the time over which the rate was guaranteed twice as long, from 10 years to 20 years. So there's this knowledge spillovers in policy making as well. I go to the next prompt. And some of the outcomes of that was creating this huge market. And even that had spillover because the demand in Germany was not just about installing a lot of solar in Germany. And it wasn't just about developing manufacturing in Germany. It was catalyzing change in the rest of the world. So if you go to the next prompt, what that demand created by policy that was set in Germany that built on policies in California and Japan was these expectations that there would be a large and growing market, and that changed investment. And it was really investment in machine tools that could be developed so that solar didn't have to use secondhand machinery from the semiconductor computer industry, but could develop wire saws like this picture here to develop its own technology that really created a platform for the cost to fall further then. Next slide. And then if we look at the most consequential reaction to the German feed-in tariff, it's what happened in China. And in China in the 1990s was an age of exploration. We had people from Australia that tried to set up manufacturing in China in 1994 and turned away because there was no interest in it. That same person who was a translator on that trip in 1994 went back as an entrepreneur in 2000 to start manufacturing in China and was successful. And he eventually became the richest person in China for about 2 or 3 years. And the way that they scaled up that company called Suntech was really scrappy. It was using these low-cost equipment that they sourced from all over the world. So again, knowledge spillovers there, using their networks of people that they knew around the world, looking for used furnaces and wafer slicers and taking those in and developing production lines and iteratively scaling it up. And the next production line was bigger than the last one and used slightly different configuration. They used equipment from all over the world. From Italy was an important source of equipment, for example. The capital for it, it was really US pension funds were going to fund a Chinese company that was going public on the New York Stock Exchange. Chinese company takes that $300 million and uses it to buy equipment from Italy, from Switzerland, and also from the US, brings that equipment back to China, develops panels that they sell first to Germany and then to other markets as subsidies change, and other markets like Spain and California, and eventually China itself become attractive. So this becomes China's own gift to the world, this low-cost solar, but it really is a story of knowledge spillovers are happening in a really deep way. And it's not just about taking a technology that worked in one place and using it in another place. It's a whole innovation system that's based on contributions that work across this. And if we start to extend this to some of the softer elements, like people adopting the technology, installer, local knowledge and tacit knowledge playing a role, that also has its own spillovers. So last slide, just to finish up. So clearly this is work in progress here. But what Jenna has shown from looking at this large set of potential analogs to inform technologies we might really care about, similar to what Aleh talked about and Jenna, looking at the past as a way to understand what's possible for future technologies, the first thing we see is a lot of heterogeneity in growth rates, in adoption, in timing, and a lot of these characteristics. If we can understand better the characteristics of technologies that matter, like Charlie's done a lot of work on granularity, that's certainly one. And then characteristics of countries that matter. So political characteristics or the ability to create in China what they call organizational capacity, that makes a really big difference. And if we can think about how we could match some of these characteristics to a target that we care about, whether it's a technology or a country context that we've already started talking a bit about in this session today, that provides an avenue for really figuring out how to best use the empirical results from history to what we really are thinking about today. What we see so far is some evidence of acceleration, so faster rates over time. We come into all of these data with an open mind and not sure what we're going to find, and that seems to be a pretty recurring pattern from some of the data that Jen has shown. There does seem to be this factor of some evidence that knowledge spillovers can speed transitions, that later adopters can go faster. And then you also have factors that impede transitions in some of the cases that Aleh showed, in which later adopters go slower, probably because of the country characteristics that led them to be slow to adopt in the first place. So, and then just bringing in the last part of looking more deeply at solar, I think understanding some of the mechanisms that enable spillover and that lead to these patterns where later adopters can go faster, I think those are probably the most promising ones. So it's collecting those examples, understanding the factors that lead to those examples, and finally really understanding what some of the mechanisms are. And we've seen some of that with solar, and we've seen some of that with other careful case studies as well. So I think that's a good path forward. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jenna and Greg. That was great. So I'd like to prompt all our audience members to send questions in. I have a timer here that tells me when this is all going to close, and it says a little less than 8 minutes. So I know we have one question from the audience, and Charlie, I was thinking maybe we begin with that, and just to make sure that our audience questions are covered, and then you and I can come back with our questions. So can we begin with the audience question, if that's okay? Just in the interest of time.
Fact, even as you were speaking, we got another audience question in.
Perfect.
So the first one was from Philippa, and it was directed at Jenna to ask whether you looked at battery technology in your early to late adoption analysis. And I guess I'm going to extend it a bit by posing the same kind of question to Greg as to whether you think the insights from the solar story with respect to knowledge spillover are being similarly observed with batteries, particularly in an EV context.
Yeah, so we have some battery technologies and storage technologies in the data set, but most of that is only long enough to really get at the growth rate at the global level. So when we look nationally at this early and late adopter dynamic, we don't have really rich data on storage technologies for what I've shown for a broad suite of storage technologies. And I can turn it over to Greg for the second part of that question.
Yeah, good. Yeah, for the second part, I think batteries look a lot similar to me, because a lot of the driving forces so batteries have a learning rate that's a little bit faster than solar. They're getting adopted really quickly, like with the slide that Charlie showed at the very beginning. And when you start to look at some of the mechanisms driving that, it looks a lot the same. I mean, we've got this, modular granular design where it's really the same design used for, the tiniest thing like in a headphones or an AirPod or something is same design that's being used for a car and for a stationary battery at a wind farm, for example. And it's just stacking them together. And so that leads to massive economies of scale and fairly footloose technology that can move around pretty easily. I think Maybe the things are a little bit different is with the solar example and some other examples in such clear view, there's no surprise to anybody how this is happening. And I think the learning curve concept is even more obvious and more front of mind to those that are developing batteries, whether it's policymakers and especially companies, that I think the rush to scale has gone even faster. And so there is this kind of idea that the only way to succeed is to go bigger than anybody else, and that the downsides of rushing and maybe having some problems with batteries or having some problems with manufacturing are much smaller than the gains you can get from economies of manufacturing scale. And I think so it's been much faster with batteries than we've seen in solar. I think because maybe they understand the mechanisms, and there's maybe something self-reinforcing about that. Belief in a learning curve leads to the outcome of a learning curve because there's such strong investment and such rapid growth. So yeah, it's an interesting comparison.
And then is it okay, Radhika? I've got one more question. I think this is for Jenna. This is from Jessica, who thanks you both for the talk, and then has a kind of more technical question asking what metric you use to measure growth and what selection criteria you use, if any, when you apply that metric.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So in the results that are the, I guess, descriptive charts that I showed today, we're using the logistic scaling parameter. So we fit a logistic function onto each time series and then use that. But we've also measured growth with other metrics like the growth around the inflection point and the Gompertz fit, and the delta T, so the time it takes from 10 to 90% of the asymptote on that logistic fit. And using that for robustness checks. And then for the selection criteria, it's a good question. You get to the national level growth, there's a lot of fits that we're looking at. So right now we do some filtering based on the R squared of that fit and how far the technology has gotten in its in the logistic fit, how far of that is real data.
Yeah, and just maybe to build on Jenna's comprehensive response to that question, I think the other thing too that we have started to do is robustness tests. So we've probably come up with 10 or 11 different ways to measure growth, and none of them works perfectly or seems like good reflection of the underlying mechanisms in every case, but some of them work in almost all cases. And if you find the same results using the 3 or 4 really kind of different families of growth metrics, then we say we kind of have results that are robust to how you measure growth. So as we go into the later adopters going faster or slower, the robustness of those results to the different metrics, I think, is going to be important to how far we can take them.
Great. 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes, actually. Charlie, do you have a question? And if you do, you and I can ask together. And if not, I'm happy to ask.
It was a quick one because obviously from Aleh's talk previous to yours, with the evidence that actually spillovers, the spillovers aren't associated with acceleration, but actually slower effects. There's obviously, it'd be really nice to get you both in the same room to talk, but I'm just wondering whether you can opine as to whether nuclear is anomalous and so difficult to draw generalizable conclusions from. And on the flip side, whether the solar story is much more generalizable and holds for other sorts of technologies, if it's possible to give a very general answer to that.
Great. And we have literally a minute left, which is to say that it seems like from the solar story, a lot of it was, the spillovers were driven by individuals, right? Individuals moving between places, between organizations, between labs. But given the role that knowledge spillover can play in enabling late adopters to move quickly, what are the kinds of systematic mechanisms for these spillovers that that we can look into and sort of push towards?
Well, I can take that last one, Radhika. I think for me, it's just the free flow of ideas moving around. And a lot of that, at least from the solar mechanisms, is free flow of people. So, people being able to do research stays in one place and go to another, people being able to set up companies in different places. I mean, it's kind of this, you end up with this stuff in a pretty pro-globalization framework when you just start describing what the spillovers are, because they're all the things that come along with low barriers to trade and low barriers to migration and things like that. So systemically, that may not be what people actually want, but if we want some of these technologies, there are some systemic levers that I think we've actually pushed in the wrong direction the last 6 or 7 years. More challenging environment if every country is kind of more up to on its own to come up with these innovations and develop them with their own capabilities. And I think maybe just quickly on Charlie's question, if I understand right, Jenna, you can maybe build on this. More data points for solar than for nuclear, so in a way, there's some more robustness there. Many more countries involved.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say that's exactly the kind of question I think we're trying to ask or answer by combining these different data and characteristics to understand which might be more generalizable.
Excellent. So we're right on time, a little bit over, but I think that brings us to the end of this this session, which has gone by very quickly and has been really great. I'm not sure we have too much time to say more. Charlie, do you want to wrap up in any way?
Yeah, no, just to echo what you said, Radhika, it's been a really, really interesting session, and thank you for all the speakers as well as the audience. And this is also just to say that in 20 minutes time, wherever you may be in the world, the energy related content on this conference continues. There's a session in 20 minutes on the role of energy in global climate mitigation and adaptation by Emily Grubert. So stay tuned. And then back to you, Radhika, for the final words.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. And again, just to say thank you to all our speakers, to the audience. Look out for our special issue on in environmental research letters, and we'll see you at the next session. Bye-bye.